Here is a number that feels so obvious you have probably never questioned it. 3. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, 3 meals, every day, for your entire life. It feels less like a choice and more like a law of physics, as fixed and unquestionable as the fact that the sun rises in the east. It is not a law of physics. It is not even particularly old. And the story of how humans ended up eating 3 meals a day on a fixed schedule, regardless of hunger, regardless of season, regardless of activity level, is a story that involves agriculture, industrial labor, religious doctrine, marketing campaigns, and at least one breakfast cereal company that may have single-handedly reshaped how an entire nation eats. So let us actually figure out where this number came from, because it did not come from biology. Biology has remarkably little to say about the number 3 when it comes to feeding yourself. Let us start with what the human body actually wants, because that is where this story has to begin. There is no biological clock inside you that demands food at 3 specific points spaced roughly 5 to 6 hours apart. The human digestive and metabolic system runs on hunger signals driven primarily by blood glucose levels, hormone fluctuations, and stomach distension, none of which are inherently tied to a 3-meal schedule. Ghrelin, the hormone most associated with hunger, rises and falls throughout the day in patterns that are heavily shaped by habit and expectation rather than fixed biological necessity. If you train your body to expect food at noon, ghrelin will rise around noon. If you train your body to expect food at 4 in the afternoon and 10 at night, ghrelin will rise then instead. The hormone follows the schedule. The schedule does not follow some pre-installed biological requirement for exactly 3 discrete eating events. This is demonstrated somewhat dramatically by the enormous range of eating patterns that exist across human history and across contemporary cultures, all of which sustain perfectly healthy human bodies. Some traditional societies eat 1 large meal a day. Some eat continuously throughout daylight hours in a grazing pattern with no discrete meals at all. Some eat 5 or 6 smaller meals. Intermittent fasting practitioners in the modern world compress their eating into a 4 to 8 hour window and report no particular metabolic catastrophe. The human body is, it turns out, remarkably flexible about when and how often you choose to feed it, as long as the total caloric and nutritional intake over a given period meets your needs. So if biology does not demand 3 meals, where did the number actually come from? The deepest roots of this story go back to the structure of agricultural and pre-agricultural life. And the picture there is considerably messier than the clean 3-meal structure we now take for granted. Hunter-gatherer eating patterns, as documented extensively by anthropologists studying contemporary traditional societies, and inferred from the archaeological and ethnographic record, were generally opportunistic rather than scheduled. You ate when food was available and when you were hungry, not according to a fixed clock. A successful hunt might produce a large meal eaten over an extended period, possibly with the entire group, possibly stretching across many hours as the kill was processed and consumed. A day without successful hunting or foraging might involve very little food at all, supplemented by whatever could be gathered along the way. The rhythm of eating tracked the rhythm of food availability, not the rhythm of the clock, because for the overwhelming majority of human evolutionary history, there was no clock to track in the first place. This irregular, opportunistic pattern persisted in various forms well into the agricultural era. Early agricultural societies, while more food secure than hunter-gatherer bands in good years, still organized eating around the practical rhythms of farm labor rather than a fixed 3-meal structure. Medieval European peasants, for instance, are documented as typically eating 2 meals a day rather than 3. A substantial meal at midday, after the morning's labor was done, and a lighter meal in the evening before sleep. Breakfast, as a distinct and named meal, was for much of medieval European history either skipped entirely or eaten only by laborers whose work demanded an early start and who needed fuel. Before the midday meal. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it directly contradicts the modern assumption that breakfast is the most fundamental and ancient of the 3 meals. In much of medieval Christian Europe, eating in the early morning was actually viewed with some suspicion. The Catholic Church had developed a doctrine around the sin of gluttony that included specific concern about excessive or unnecessary eating and eating immediately upon waking, before any labor had been performed to justify the need for fuel, was sometimes framed as an indulgence rather than a necessity. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, explicitly discussed the question of whether eating before the appropriate hour constituted a form of gluttony and concluded that eating too early in the day without sufficient justification was indeed a moral failing. So, for a meaningful stretch of European history, the meal we now consider the most essential and most virtuous, the one nutritionists have spent decades insisting you should never skip, was viewed by religious authorities as something closer to a temptation to be resisted. The reversal of this attitude, and the eventual establishment of breakfast as a respectable and then essential meal, has a history that is tangled up with changes in labor patterns, urbanization, and eventually, very directly, with marketing. The Industrial Revolution is the turning point where the modern three-meal structure really begins to crystallize into something resembling its current form. And the reason is straightforward. Industrial labor demanded a schedule that agricultural labor did not. Agricultural work, while physically demanding, has a flexibility to it that factory work does not. A farmer can decide, within reasonable limits, when to eat based on the natural rhythms of the day, the weather, and the specific tasks at hand. A factory worker operating machinery on a production line, synchronized with hundreds of other workers and dependent on the continuous operation of shared equipment, cannot simply decide to eat whenever hunger strikes. The factory schedule imposed structure on eating in a way that agricultural and even earlier urban craft labor never had to. Meals had to be scheduled around shift times, and shift times were determined by the factory owners, not by the workers' hunger. This produced, across the 19th century in industrializing countries, a standardization of meal timing that had never existed before at anything like this scale. Breakfast became the meal eaten before the workday started. Lunch became the meal eaten during a designated break in the middle of the workday, and dinner became the meal eaten after the workday ended. The three-meal structure that emerged was not derived from any nutritional principle. It was derived from the shape of the industrial workday, which itself had been derived from the practical requirements of running factories efficiently. Once this structure existed for practical reasons, it quickly accumulated cultural and moral significance that went well beyond its practical origins. Eating breakfast became associated with discipline, with preparing properly for the demands of the day, with being the kind of responsible worker who fueled up before starting. Skipping breakfast became associated with laziness, with poor planning, with a kind of moral failing that had nothing to do with the actual nutritional consequences of skipping a meal. This cultural shift was significantly accelerated and, to some degree, actively engineered by a series of marketing campaigns in the early 20th century that deserve specific attention because they represent one of the more brazen examples of corporate influence on something as fundamental as the structure of daily eating. The breakfast cereal industry, particularly companies like Kellogg's and Post, built their entire business model around convincing American consumers that breakfast was not merely acceptable, but essential, the most important meal of the day, in a phrase that became so ubiquitous it is now treated as received nutritional wisdom rather than what it actually was, which was an advertising slogan with no particularly strong scientific backing at the time it was popularized. The phrase itself has a documented history. It gained widespread circulation in the early 20th century, promoted heavily by cereal manufacturers who had an extremely direct financial interest in convincing people that breakfast was not just a meal, but a critical, health-determining ritual that should ideally involve their specific product. The marketing was remarkably effective. Surveys of public attitudes toward breakfast before and after the major cereal marketing campaigns of the 1920s and 1930s show a measurable shift toward viewing breakfast as nutritionally essential, a shift that tracks suspiciously closely with the advertising spending of the companies that stood to profit most from it. This is not to say that breakfast has no nutritional value, or that the companies invented the concept of morning eating from nothing. People had been eating in the morning for various reasons long before Kellogg's existed, but the specific cultural conviction that breakfast is uniquely, scientifically essential, more important than lunch, more important than dinner, the meal you skip at your own peril, appears to be substantially a product of 20th century marketing rather than ancient nutritional wisdom or deep biological necessity. The modern nutritional science on this question, for what it is worth, is considerably more equivocal than the marketing slogan suggests. Large-scale studies on whether skipping breakfast leads to weight gain, metabolic dysfunction, or other negative health outcomes have produced genuinely mixed results, with some studies suggesting modest benefits to regular breakfast consumption, and others finding no significant difference, or even modest benefits to skipping it, depending on the population studied and the specific outcomes measured. The scientific consensus that existed for decades that breakfast was unambiguously essential has weakened considerably as more rigorous research has accumulated, even as the popular conviction remains largely unchanged. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. Lunch has its own distinct history that diverges in interesting ways from breakfast's story. The very concept of lunch as a distinct, named midday meal is, in linguistic terms, remarkably recent. The word lunch itself, as a reference to a midday meal, only became common in English usage in the early 19th century, derived from the earlier and less formal luncheon, which referred to a light snack rather than a substantial meal. Before this period, the midday meal in much of English-speaking society was simply called dinner, and it was typically the largest and most substantial meal of the day, eaten in the early afternoon after the morning's work was done. The shift of dinner from midday to evening, and the corresponding promotion of lunch from a minor snack to a full meal in its own right, tracked the same industrial transformation that reshaped breakfast. As work moved away from agricultural and household-based labor, where the midday meal naturally fit between morning and afternoon tasks, and toward factory and office labor with fixed working hours, the practical logic of eating a large meal in the middle of a continuous workday shifted. A substantial midday meal that required time to prepare, eat, and digest was incompatible with a factory schedule that demanded continuous attendance. The solution was to shrink the midday meal into something that could be consumed quickly during a brief, designated break, and to move the substantial meal of the day to the evening when the workday had ended and there was no schedule pressure forcing a return to labor. This is why lunch, in most modern Western contexts, is conceptually positioned as the lightest of the three meals, the one most associated with quick, portable, efficient food, while dinner retains the cultural weight of being the substantial, social, often family-oriented meal of the day. This is a direct inheritance from the industrial reorganization of the workday, not from any deep nutritional logic about when large meals are most appropriate. Dinner's evolution into the evening's primary meal also intersects with the history of artificial lighting in ways that are worth noting. Before reliable, affordable artificial lighting, eating a substantial meal late in the evening was impractical for most households, because preparing and consuming food in darkness was inconvenient and the available light sources were expensive enough that many households used them sparingly. As gas lighting and later electric lighting became widespread and affordable across the 19th and 20th centuries, the practical barriers to evening activity, including eating, diminished substantially. Dinner's promotion to the primary meal of the day is, in part, a story about the history of lighting technology. So, if the three-meal structure is this recent and this contingent on specific historical circumstances, why has it proven so durable? Why, in an era when most people no longer work in factories with rigid shift schedules, do we still organize our eating around this same three-meal structure that was originally designed to fit factory labor? Part of the answer is simple cultural inertia. Once a pattern becomes deeply embedded in social institutions, school schedules built around lunch periods, workplace cultures built around lunch breaks, family life organized around shared dinners, restaurant industries built around breakfast, lunch, and dinner service periods, the pattern becomes self-reinforcing even after the original practical justification for it weakens or disappears. Part of the answer is also social and relational. Meals are not purely nutritional events. They are social occasions, opportunities for family and community connection, structured points in the day around which social life organizes itself. The shared dinner, in particular, carries enormous cultural weight as a site of family bonding and connection that goes well beyond its nutritional function. There is also a genuinely interesting psychological dimension to why fixed meal schedules persist even in the absence of strict biological necessity. Humans, it turns out, generally prefer predictability and structure in their daily routines, and eating according to a fixed schedule provides a reliable anchor point around which the rest of the day can be organized. Decision fatigue is a genuine phenomenon, and outsourcing the decision of when to eat to an external schedule, even an arbitrary one, frees up cognitive resources for other decisions. The military and institutional history of meal scheduling deserves attention here too, because armies and large institutions were among the earliest organizations to formalize meal timing on a mass scale, well before factories existed in their modern form. Roman legions operated on relatively disciplined eating schedules tied to march timing and camp routines. Medieval monasteries developed extraordinarily precise schedules around eating, prayer, and labor, with specific bells marking the transition from one activity to another throughout the day. These institutional precedents for scheduled communal eating at fixed times predate industrial factories by many centuries, and they likely contributed to the cultural plausibility of the factory schedule when it eventually arrived. It is also worth noting that the three-meal structure is far from universal even in the present day. Spain maintains a meal schedule that includes a substantial midday meal and a notably late dinner, often after 9 in the evening, reflecting historical patterns around the heat of the Iberian afternoon and an extended siesta tradition. Many traditions in the Middle East and parts of Africa maintain eating patterns shaped significantly by religious fasting practices, most notably the Ramadan fasting schedule, which inverts ordinary daytime eating entirely for a full lunar month each year, demonstrating just how flexible human eating schedules can be when shaped by religious rather than industrial logic. There is a deeper biological story here that adds an important layer of nuance, and it concerns the circadian rhythm and its relationship to digestion and metabolism. The human body operates according to circadian rhythms, internal biological clocks that regulate sleep, hormone release, body temperature, and metabolic processes across a roughly 24-hour cycle. These rhythms are influenced primarily by light exposure, but also by the timing of food intake. Research in chronobiology has revealed that the body's capacity to metabolize food efficiently varies meaningfully across the day, generally favoring earlier eating over later eating, even when the total caloric content of the food is identical. Insulin sensitivity, for instance, tends to be higher earlier in the day and lower in the evening, meaning that the same meal eaten at 8 in the morning may produce a smaller blood glucose spike and be processed more efficiently than the identical meal eaten at 8 at night. This has led some researchers to advocate for front-loading caloric intake earlier in the day rather than concentrating it in the evening, which is an interesting irony given that the historical trend has moved in precisely the opposite direction. This circadian research does not vindicate the specific number 3. What it suggests, more subtly, is that the timing of eating relative to the body's internal clock matters in ways that go beyond simple caloric accounting, and that the modern pattern of light breakfast, moderate lunch, and heavy dinner may be working against rather than with the body's natural metabolic rhythms for a meaningful portion of the population. The question of snacking deserves its own discussion, because the rise of the snack as a recognized eating category represents another layer of complexity beyond the simple three-meal framework. For much of the 20th century, snacking between meals was discouraged by mainstream nutritional advice. The snack food industry, much like the breakfast cereal industry before it, played a substantial role in normalizing and eventually celebrating between-meal eating as a legitimate practice. For reasons that are not difficult to identify, an industry built around products designed for consumption, outside of formal mealtimes, benefits enormously from a culture that views snacking positively rather than as undisciplined indulgence. Let us turn briefly to a related and often overlooked piece of this puzzle, the question of how meal structure interacts with social class. Historically, wealthier households were able to maintain more elaborate, more clearly differentiated meal structures. Poorer households, constrained by both food availability and the demands of labor, frequently maintained simpler patterns that did not necessarily map cleanly onto the three-meal ideal being promoted by etiquette books, advertising, and emerging nutritional science. The three-meal structure has often functioned as much as an aspirational class marker as a description of actual universal practice. There is also an interesting comparative dimension worth exploring: how children's eating schedules have historically differed from adult schedules within the same households. Infants eat according to a demand-driven schedule that has nothing to do with 3 discrete meals. They eat when hungry, as often as every 2 to 3 hours, a pattern that closely resembles the opportunistic eating patterns documented in hunter-gatherer societies far more closely than it resembles the adult three-meal structure. As children grow, they are gradually trained into the adult three-meal pattern, a process that essentially constitutes a multi-year project of overriding the more frequent, demand-driven eating pattern that humans appear to default to in the absence of cultural conditioning. One more thread worth pulling is the question of what happens when the three-meal structure collides with modern shift work, because this collision reveals just how arbitrary the original schedule really was. Nurses, factory workers on night shifts, emergency responders, and others who work overnight or rotating schedules face a genuine and well-documented problem. Their bodies are still operating to some degree on the circadian assumptions built up over a lifetime of daytime activity, but their work schedule demands that they be alert, productive, and fed at hours that the traditional breakfast, lunch, dinner framework was never designed to accommodate. Research on shift workers consistently finds elevated rates of metabolic dysfunction, weight gain, and digestive complaints compared to day shift workers with otherwise similar lifestyles. And a significant portion of this difference appears to be attributable specifically to the mismatch between an inherited cultural meal structure designed around daytime industrial labor and the actual demands of a body trying to function on an inverted schedule. The three-meal structure was never universal biology being expressed. It was a specific solution to a specific problem, and when the problem changes, the solution stops working as well. What you are left with after tracing this entire history is a number, 3, that feels as natural and inevitable as gravity, but that turns out to be a remarkably specific and contingent product of factory whistles, papal doctrine about sin, advertising executives in the early 20th century, monastery bells ringing centuries earlier, and a body that, left to its own devices, and its own hunger signals, would probably ask for something rather different. The sun, as it happens, does not care how many times you eat. Your body within fairly wide margins does not care that much either. The number 3 is not a law of biology. It is a compromise between factory whistles, religious guilt about gluttony, monastery bells, and a cereal company's advertising budget. And it has been working well enough, for long enough, that almost no one ever stops to ask why.